Okay, today we are going to be working on section 9.1, part 2. And we're going to do a little bit of a review of completing the square. We did this last semester, so it's been quite a while ago, probably about 6 months ago since we've worked on completing the square. So let's... pen is always missing what I need. There it is. Okay. Let's look at a little example here so I can demonstrate an example as we go. So let's use 32 plus 8x plus x squared equals 0. So let's say this is an equation that you've been given. You're asked to complete the square for this particular equation. So very first step, we want to organize our data. So when I look at this, a lot of things that I wanted in descending order. I also want my constant value on the right hand side. Now as we get into this a little bit more, in your homework assignment that's actually for this section, you're going to have x values that you have to complete the square for, as well as y values you have to complete the square for, all in the same problem. So it'll take a lot of organizing when we get a little bit farther. This one, not too bad. But a little bit later, when you start getting two variables in one question, then you have to be really careful. So we will group our variables, get them together, write them in descending order according to the variable, and then get all constants onto the right hand side of the equation. So let's do this step 1 here. We're going to organize. So x squared plus 8x is equal to negative 32. So organize my data, got my x's together in a group. I put them in descending order, and I move the constant to the right hand side. So we are good for step 1. Step 2, factor if the leading coefficient is not 1. Our leading coefficient is 1, so we don't have to worry about that. We're going to skip that step. Now we want to rewrite leaving blanks. So when we complete the square, what we are doing is we were going to add something on the left hand side, add something here to make this a perfect square. But whatever we do to the left-hand side, we also have to do to the right-hand side. So we're going to leave blanks for both sides of our equal sign. Okay, that is step 3. Okay, step 4. Now we can go ahead and complete the square. And the way we complete the square is we take 8, multiply it by 1/2. So we're going to take 1/2 of 8, which is 4, and then square it. Okay, so then we have 4 squared in the first blank. 4 squared is 16, and that's how I want to write it on this right-hand side. Okay, now why didn't I write 16 over here on this left-hand side? Biggest reason is because when we go on to this next step, well, let's see, we did 3 and 4 together because we added 16 to the right-hand side also. Now, if we had something, if a, or our leading coefficient, was not 1, we would have had an a value that we would have to remember to multiply. So that's why I put this there. Just make sure if you're factoring something out on the left-hand side that you multiply it to that value that you're going to add to the right-hand side. And we'll look at some examples of that and talk about it a little bit more in just a minute. So, what were we talking about? Oh, why do I leave that as 4 squared? Because my next step, oh, shoot. Alright, we are going to be going over section 9.1, part 2 today. And this is going to be a quick review of completing the square. Maybe I shouldn't say quick, pretty drawn out. I wrote all of the steps. We're going to go through an example. I'm also going to put an example up here on the side as we go. So let's look at the equation for an example. 32 plus 8x plus x squared equals 0. So we're going to use that as an example. Let's say our directions are to complete the square for this. These are the steps that we need to go through. So very first step, organize your data. Now, by organizing our data, I put that into 2 groups. We want to group our variables together. Now, in this case, we only have x variables. But as we get further into this assignment, we're going to have x variables and y variables. So we'll want to group our x variables separately than our y variables, and also write them in descending order. Okay, put constant values on the right hand side. So we're going to rewrite this so that our x variables are grouped together, and then we're going to put our constants on the right hand side, just like that. Okay, so that's step 1. Step 2 is to factor if the leading coefficient a is not 1. So in this case, our leading coefficient is a, so we can skip that second step. Step 3 is to rewrite leaving blanks. So our whole purpose in completing the square is to make the left-hand side of our equation a perfect square trinomial. So we're going to do x squared plus 8x plus something is going to be equal to negative 32. Now we can't just add something into our equation, we have to counterbalance it. So if we add it to the left-hand side, we're also going to add it to the right-hand side. Okay. Then, step 4, complete the square. We're going to fill in the blanks on the left-hand side with b over 2 squared. So that's half of b. Well, half of b is 4. And then we need to square it. So you can kind of make that into a 2-step process. So bring that down as half, bring it back up, and square it. So 4 squared is what we'll write in there. Okay. Now, on the right-hand side, I want to write that in a more simplified manner so I can add that to negative 32 easier. So 4 squared is 16, and so that's how we're going to bring that down. Okay, now why didn't I go ahead and write 16 over here on the left-hand side? And the reason is because when we get down here to step 6, where we're going to factor, so I kind of did, I did step 4, 5 was to add the 16 to the right-hand side. If we would have had an a value, I would have had to multiply that 16 by the a value. And we'll get to some examples that use that. But this one, we did not have to worry about that a value. So we just added 16 to the right-hand side. Okay, so now on the left-hand side, we can factor that equation. So we're always going to bring these down. So we have x. We're always going to use this sign. So plus, if that would have been a minus, I'd have a minus here. And then I'm going to use this number before it was squared. Now, I'm not always going to bring these numbers down here like this, so I'd prefer you to just write that as 4 squared. Then it's really easy to factor. Okay, it's all written right there for you. So x plus 4 squared, and then on the right hand side is going to be equal to negative 16. Okay, I should go back through and make that a positive, so it actually, you can tell I made that problem up, that example up. Let's make that a positive, and so that we have a number that's actually, not actually undefined. Okay, so then that would make it 48. Okay, and a negative 32 up there. Okay. That's what I get for making up an example. Okay, so rewrite and simplify as needed. Everything looks really good. We factored it. We rewrote on the right-hand side, simplified that right-hand side. So we are done with our completing the square. Now, completing the square has different purposes from this point forward. The way we're going to be using them is we're going to be using it to write in terms of a circle and in terms of an ellipse for this homework assignment. So we will look at some examples of that. Okay, our first example, well, it's not really our first example A, so this is just a review again of completing the square for this equation. So first thing that we want to do is we want to get them in order, so organize all of our data. So we want to rewrite this as x squared minus 14x is equal to negative 9. Then we want to, we would factor anything out if that was not a 1. If it was anything else other than a 1, we'd factor it out. Nothing there, so we're good to just go on to our next step. Our next step is going to be rewrite leaving blanks where we need them. So x squared minus 14x plus something is equal to negative 9 plus the same something. Okay. Now we're ready to go ahead and complete our square. So I'm going to take half of 14, which is 7, and then I'm going to square that, which then becomes 7 squared here. Now when I bring it over to the other side of the equal sign, I want to write it as 49. So I'm going to write it as actually what 7 squared is, which is 49. Okay. Now on our left-hand side, we need to factor. So we're going to use the square root of our first term, which is x. I'm going to have the minus. I'm going to skip that whole middle term. Don't even worry about that. And then the minus 7. And then all squared. Now if you FOILed this back out, we would get x squared minus 7x again, plus 49. And that would be exactly what we have up here, the x squared minus 14x, when we simplify our middle terms. So if you go backwards on any of these, you should be able to get back to your original equation. Okay, now we're ready for the right-hand side. So negative 9 plus 49 is equal to 40, and then we are done. And so we have completed the square for that example. Okay, next problem, I'm going to change this again because, again, it's going to end up being something that is imaginary or does not work. We don't want that. Okay, so let's say that this is a minus sign and not a plus. Okay, so we have negative 6y minus 75 plus 3y squared equals 0. And we want to complete the square for this. So very first step, we need to organize all of our data. So we're going to get our variables together, write them in descending order, and get the constants on the right-hand side. So we've got 3y squared minus 6y equals 75. Okay. Now this time we actually have to factor. This is the first time we've had an a value that is something other than 1. So we're going to factor that 3 out. So we have y squared minus 2y is equal to 75. Okay. Now I know we could actually simplify this right here and divide that 75 out, but I do not want to do that. That's not always possible when we're completing the square, and I want you to see what happens when we actually have to use that 3 out in front. So I know it's tempting to divide by 3 and just simplify everything, but I'm not going to do that because that's not where I want to go with this example. Okay, so we have our 3 out in front, and inside we have y squared minus 2y. So we're on to the next step where we're rewriting and leaving the blanks. So plus a blank, and then also notice that when we have a value that we factored out, we need everything on the inside of the parentheses on that left-hand side that has to do with those variables. So pretty soon we'll have x variables and y variables. Just need to keep the y's together and the x's together. Keep them together in a group, even if we have to put in parentheses. Okay. Then on the right-hand side, we also need to add up the same blank, except this blank is inside of something that's being multiplied by 3. So on this right-hand side, we also need to create that grouping of 3 times this same blank. Okay. Now if you do that every time you have an a value, things will work out a lot better for you. Also work a lot better if we would actually write the numbers that are in our problem. So let's put a 75 there instead of just a 7. Okay. So now we're ready to complete our square. We're going to take half of 2, which is 1, and square it. So we're going to put 1 squared here. What we put over here on the other side is going to be the actual number so that we can combine all of our constants. Okay. So now we can factor on this left-hand side. We have to keep the grouping there, keep the 3 out in front. So we're going to have y minus 1. So always use that same first sign when we factor. So y minus 1, this number is going to come around here for that 1, squared on the outside of the parentheses is equal to, now we can simplify on this right-hand side, And that's kind of our last step, so we're combining a couple steps here. So 75 plus 3